welcome to Lies, the part of Extra History where I get to tell you all the stories that we couldn't fit into the script, and where we confess to all the places where we screwed up. And we've got a couple for you this time. But first off, Walpole. You might have noticed the Where's Walpole moment in the videos. We ain't done with Walpole yet. We were all cracking up about how this guy had his hands in everything, and so I said, I bet we can connect Walpole to every other topic. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to do that, but I certainly can with today's episodes. So if you want to play 5 Degrees of Walpole with me, join in, and at this end of the episode, I will tell you my answer. I think you'll get a kick out of how directly he was connected with the making of this series. But on to serious stuff. We have a few major things to clear up. In episode 2, we showed the Hagia Sophia with minarets. This killed me when I saw it. But, on the other hand, it does allow me to spend a lot of this episode talking about the awesome history of the Hagia Sophia, so let's go for it. The Hagia Sophia is this architectural marvel. If you ever get the chance, you should go to Istanbul and see it. It was indubitably the world's most impressive church at the time of its construction, and simply to be built, they had to invent all these new construction techniques. What's more is the speed at which they built it is just unbelievable. It took 6 years. 6 years without modern machinery to build this radically new church. St. Peter's, built almost 1,000 years later, took like 120 years to complete. And the Sagrada Familia has been under construction for more than 140 years and still not done. But all this haste had its cost. The mortar in the walls wasn't even dry by the time they tried putting up the dome, and so it actually bent the walls, and the original dome collapsed within 40 years to have to be replaced by a future generation. This, to me, always makes the Hagia Sophia the perfect metaphor for Justinian's reign, right? Ambitious, inspiring, leaving a permanent mark in humanity, and yet, in some ways, fatally flawed because of its haste and overreach. Yet, the Hagia Sophia, despite its flaws, serves as an inspiration for the centuries, being studied during the Renaissance all the way through to today. And when the Ottoman forces captured Constantinople, the Hagia Sophia was ordered spared and converted into a mosque, and hence the minarets you saw around it, and that you can see around it today. The Ottoman Sultan, 1,000 years after the construction of the Hagia Sophia, decided to prove his power by showing that his empire could build something as grand as this thing built a millennium before, right? And erected the Blue Mosque a mere block away. And when the Ottomans fell, Hagia Sophia outlasted them too, and was turned into a museum by the secularizing Turkish state. There's one more correction in the art that I'd like to make. In episode 4, when we talk about Belisarius' triumph, we probably should have shown him also with a menorah, because according to Procopius, Belisarius showed up with the menorah. Yep, the one that's supposed to have burnt for 8 days on 1 day's oil. While this may seem far-fetched, Titus and Vespasian supposedly brought it back to Rome for their triumph over Judea in 40 CE. And when the Vandals came and sacked Rome, they grabbed it in 455 CE. So if you believe that the one that Titus and Vespasian snatched was the real thing, it's reasonably likely that Belisarius paraded through Rome with the menorah. Alright, enough neat history and lore. I know I'm burning through the minutes. I know last time I went over long. And I feel like that's happened with this whole series, right? I feel like this is the series I struggled the most with, even though it's one of the periods that I know the best of everything we've covered. But the truth is, when I started out, I thought I'd cover all of Justinian and Theodora's reign. But I had to keep cutting because Justinian just did so many things simultaneously. I could have, and perhaps should have, dedicated a whole series to each of the characters I mentioned in episode 2, but I just didn't have the space. And unfortunately, Theodora ends up underplayed in these episodes because we never got to the part where she comes back in the second half of the Roman campaign, right after they capture Rome. Hopefully, someday you'll all vote for us to finish this series, and I can get to more of that. But man, these two did more in a 5-year space, right, than most monarchs do in their entire reign. So, if this series caught your attention at all, there's a lot more to dig into than we could do justice to. But let's hop to answering some questions, and hopefully that'll flesh things out a bit. In episode 1, many people asked why I kept switching between calling it the Byzantine Empire and the Roman Empire. This is actually intentional. I wanted people who may never have studied this period before to get used to seeing these as interchangeable terms. The people living at the time would have simply called it the Roman Empire. People living in the empire would have considered themselves Romans. For them, there was no fall of the Roman Empire. There was no sharp delineation in the way that we draw it now. But as historians, especially historians who were focused on the history of Western Europe, started to draw that delineation, they needed something to call the contingent of the Roman Empire that hung on for 1,000 years after they labeled the Roman Empire as falling. Hence, the Byzantine Empire, because Byzantium was the name of the city that Constantine basically built Constantinople, the heart of the empire, on top of. And speaking of Constantinople, some people mentioned that they thought Constantinople was in Thrace, not in Anatolia. And I thought this was awesome, because it absolutely is in Thrace. What we call today Anatolia is basically the part of Turkey that's east of the Bosphorus. But what's called classical Anatolia, the Anatolia of this period, as far as I understand it, includes Thrace. And if I'm wrong about that, I apologize. Demarcation lines that move around a bit but retain the same name are super confusing. But if you were confused by that, look up classical Anatolia and tell me if I'm just way off base. In episode 2, by the way, we have the secret history. A lot of you want to know how we know this thing was written by Procopius. And while it's not signed, it's from the right period. It often references the author's other books, which are all books we know Procopius wrote. And there's a fair amount of scholarship showing that stylistically it pretty much matches his work. So there's a fair bit of consensus here. Also in episode 2, I wanted to talk about jurisprudence. Most importantly, for those of you who are worried about the horrible abuses at the chariot races, Justinian did outlaw the practice of charioteers putting curses on their opponents. Seriously though, I can't express how important this Justinian code is, or how big of an undertaking it is. Imagine if someone were to try and rationalize and compress all of US law, right? And that's what we're talking about, except this is for an empire that's been around for 1,000 years. Of course, Tribonian wasn't above just rewriting certain earlier legal decisions to make them all agree, but still, massive work, right? The legal work of Tribonian served as a template for Renaissance lawmakers as they were trying to figure out how to govern larger cities and more complicated polities. It was the basis of the Napoleonic Code, which influenced later law most of the world over. I mean, heck, 23 lawgivers, only 23, are enshrined in sort of bas-relief in the US House of Representatives. One of them is Tribonian, the other is Justinian. In episode 3, I wanted to talk a little about Narses, the guy who fought in the Hippodrome with Belisarius, because I had to cut him from episode 2. The episode where we talk about all of Justinian's other characters, but it's because he actually becomes incredibly important right after where this series ends. He serves as one of Justinian's main generals in Italy after this point. But like all of Justinian's crew, Narses wasn't without his quirks. It's been said that the Virgin Mary told him when it was time to attack, and he wouldn't go into battle without her direct consent. And also in episode 3, poor Hypatius, who the mob elevated to emperor really without his consent, gets dragged before Justinian, and Justinian's about to pardon him when Theodora actually steps in and says that if Hypatius lives, the realm will never have peace because there's another claimant to the throne. And she's the one who actually ends up getting him executed. And in episode 4, we run into a hilarious problem which cracked me up because I didn't even think about it, but it involves the difference between words as written and words as said. There's a part early on where I talk about Orthodox Roman Christianity. In the script, this is small o Orthodox, something which all Nicene Christians, basically everybody in mainstream Roman Empire, would consider themselves. But a lot of people thought I was referring to Big O Orthodox Christianity, which of course is doubly confusing because Big O Orthodox Christianity is what we call the Eastern Roman Christianity after the Schism of 1054. Neat fact about the word Orthodox, though, you know where that's first used, where the first time the word Orthodox ever shows up? Codex Justinianus. Speaking of words, it was awesome watching a bunch of people realize we still use the word vandal in the way that we do because of how thoroughly they sacked Rome. And another word thing, this one's bad. Arian Christianity, spelled A-R-I-A-N, has absolutely no relation to the Indo-Iranian Aryan cultural group, spelled Ayran that was so misused in the 20th century. If we ever do that episode on early Christian heresies, we'll dive deep into what Arianism means. But for right now, the key thing to know is just that the Vandals followed the teaching of a guy named Arius, who the Romans considered heretical. Oh, and since we're on episode 4, neat fact. Remember how that battle they had that I said was 10 miles outside of Carthage? Well, that battle is called the Battle of Adesium, which literally means at the 10-mile marker, because the Romans were as fastidious about putting mile markers on their roads as we are. Oh, also, someone I had to cut entirely from the series was John the Armenian. He was Belisarius' cavalry commander, and he was actually the guy who killed Gelimer's brother. He was loved by the army, he worked fantastically with Belisarius, and then he just sort of dies randomly in a friendly fire incident after the war is essentially over. They're chasing down the last 300 of Gelimer's men or whatever. And I think it's just fantastic historical what if. If you dig further into the series, or if we ever get to do the second half of the series, and you're looking at the latter part of the campaign, what happens after Rome and Italy, I think it's just awesome historical what if to see what would have happened if this guy was commanding some of Belisarius' forces instead of the people who took over. What if this guy had never died? It's just a fascinating question. But there's a couple other things I want to get to. I want to talk about Belisarius. So, in episode 5, remember how we ended with Belisarius sending a polite note to the garrison saying, "Would you please surrender? It'd be better for everybody." I was totally serious. He literally said this to them. I got his note right here. He said to them, "When I see, as in the mirror of the cities which have been captured in times past, this city of Naples falling victim to such a fate, I am moved to pity both it and you, its inhabitants. For such means have now been perfected by me against the city that its capture is inevitable. But I pray that an ancient city, which has for ages been inhabited by both Christians and Romans, may not meet with such a fortune, especially at my hands as commander of Roman troops, not least because in my army are a multitude of barbarians who have lost brothers or relatives before the walls of your town. For the fury of these men, I should be unable to control if they were to capture the city by act of war." And what cracks me up about this is, right, Belisarius, from everything I've read about him, I believe him to be totally serious. I believe this to be totally genuine note. But you can see why somebody might not believe you send them a note saying, "Hey, I figured out a way to take over your town. You're gonna inevitably lose, so why don't you just surrender to me without a fight? That'd be best for everybody." And yet, of course, it's absolutely true. But all right, jumping to episode 6, some people kept wondering why Belisarius had fewer and fewer troops throughout all this time. On the strategic level, as Justinian took over more areas, North Africa, as they pushed a little bit of the other borders out, they had to keep garrisoning those areas. And especially North Africa, we didn't get to talk about it, but there's a bunch of rebellions. The empire fails to pay the troops in North Africa. Belisarius has to go back and sort of assure the troops that they're going to get their pay. And so many of the empire's troops are now tied down with these expanded borders, and we haven't expanded really the tax revenue yet. And so it's not like they can pay for more troops or levy more troops. And so this leaves them with less forces to give Belisarius each time. And then on the tactical level, as Belisarius goes through Italy, right, the more successful he is, the less men he has, because he has to leave a garrison at every town. And as Italy just opens up his doors to him, it leaves him with almost nobody by the time that he gets to Rome to defend the giant walls of Rome. I just want to share a few anecdotes, and then I promise I'm done. But I just feel like I didn't convey how awesome this guy was. Remember in the Siege of Rome, where he fires 3 shots, downs 3 guys, and then he just laughs at the enemy? This is absolutely true. This is an historical record, exactly like that. And throughout the siege, he made all sorts of double checks to make sure that nobody could turn traitor. He had all this stuff in place, right? He changed the city locks regularly. He rotated watch captains for each squad. He had multiple captains for every squad each night, so that way he could make sure that he would check the records against each other, and each of them give him an attendance sheet for his squad each morning. My favorite part, though, is he had a group of out-of-work musicians spend every night, they would play music all night so the guys in the watch didn't fall asleep. Oh, and remember we set up those water mills on barges when they cut the aqueducts so we could keep the grain flowing in Rome? Well, this guy was really sharp. Like, he had them set up these water mills right behind one of the bridges because he noticed that where the bridge struts narrowed the channel of water, the water flowed faster, so it would push the mills more efficiently. That was just from guys, it goes way beyond war. That's the sort of guy this guy was. And speaking of defending the walls, he would have his Moorish troops walk the walls with dogs every night because they couldn't communicate with Goths. They didn't share a language with the Goths outside, so they couldn't be subverted. Oh, and this is one that I also have to read, and then I'm done. I really am. But when Vitiges offered to let him surrender Rome and let his troops out of Rome if he'd surrender, here's his answer back. I tell you that the time will come when, reduced to your last detachment and driven from your furthest village, you shall seek and scarcely find a refuge in bushes and brambles. We are engaged in a national and rightful cause. If anyone amongst you thinks to enter Rome without disputing every foot of ground and meeting with the most determined resistance, he shall find himself grievously mistaken. So long as Belisarius shall survive, expect no surrender. Alright, with that one, I really am done. It's just, he should be a more noted character in history than he is. So, get this, right? One of my sources was a guy named Earl Philip Henry Stanhope. Now, I didn't get to mention him much, but the first Earl of Stanhope was one of the principal Whigs during the South Sea Bubble. Walpole kicked him around in some earlier politicking, but in the end, Walpole saves him from ruin as the whole South Sea Bubble collapses. If Walpole hadn't screened the first Earl of Stanhope, who knows if his great-great-grandson, Philip Henry Stanhope, would have had the leisure time to become one of the noted historians of his age and write literally the most expensive text on Belisarius we pretty much still have. So, Walpole in two. And so there you have it, right? I find this period fascinating because Justinian left us with so much. This guy who, in his race to greatness, left us with all these things that still affect us today, but in that race to greatness, he often left us with half-finished works for future generations to fix or let crumble. It's so fascinating because had another few emperors with his ability, his ambition, and his vision followed him, perhaps today we'd see him as the greatest of Roman emperors. Perhaps today we'd all be living in Rome, but instead, we dub him the last man to dream. So, with that, I'll leave you all and just say join us next time, because next time we're going to get into the First Crusade, and it's going to be awesome because this tale is completely unlike the one I was told in school. Alright, see you next time.